There is a company you have almost certainly given money to. It made the machine in your living room, or your child's backpack, or your own. Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, the Switch. A library of worlds that has sold billions of games into nearly every country on Earth. Now travel back. Before the consoles, this same company sold instant rice that nobody wanted. It ran a fleet of taxis. It operated a chain of short-stay love hotels in Kyoto. And before all of that, long before, it was a tiny shop where one man painted playing cards by hand from the bark of mulberry trees. 1889. A back street in Kyoto. No electricity in the workshop. Its most reliable customers were the gambling dens run by the yakuza. That shop is the same company that now defines modern play. This is the story of how it survived 130 years of near death, by reinventing itself over and over every single time the world tried to kill it. Start at the beginning. The year is 1889. A craftsman named Fusajiro Yamauchi opens a small business in the Shimogyo ward of Kyoto. He calls it Nintendo Kopai. The name is often translated as "leave luck to heaven," though in truth, no one is entirely certain what Yamauchi meant by it. His product is hanafuda, flower cards. 48 small cards painted with plum blossoms, cherry trees, and moonlit cranes, used for a whole family of Japanese games. Yamauchi makes them by hand, pressing and lacquering mulberry bark into stiff, durable cards. There is a reason this is a business worth starting. 7 years earlier, Japan banned most forms of gambling, but hanafuda slipped through the cracks. The cards themselves were perfectly legal. The games people played with them very often were not. And so the best customers for Yamauchi's beautiful flower cards were the backroom gambling parlors of Kyoto. Many of them run by the yakuza. Other card makers in Kyoto wanted nothing to do with that crowd. The association with crime, with gamblers and organized syndicates was a stain on the trade. One by one, the rivals quietly left the business. Fusajiro Yamauchi did the opposite. He stayed. He leaned in. Within a few years, he was the largest hanafuda maker in the city. His premium decks were called Daitorio, President, and they carried an unlikely face on the box, Napoleon Bonaparte. Then came the deal that made Nintendo national. Japan's tobacco monopoly agreed to sell the cards in cigarette shops across the entire country. Suddenly, a single Kyoto workshop had nationwide distribution. By the early 20th century, Nintendo was the playing card king of Japan. If you find stories like this one fascinating, a company built one stubborn decision at a time. Consider subscribing. There is a great deal more to uncover. But a playing card empire, however dominant, has a ceiling. And a man was coming who would smash straight through it. 1949. The aging head of the family company suffers a stroke, and control passes to his great-grandson. His name is Hiroshi Yamauchi. He is 22 years old, a university student, and he has one condition before he will accept the job. He must be the only family member in the entire company. The board agrees. Hiroshi walks in, and almost immediately, fires every senior manager who had served his grandfather. He purges anyone who might question a 22-year-old. It is ruthless, and it is completely deliberate. For the next 53 years, Hiroshi Yamauchi will run Nintendo as something close to an absolute monarch. A man with no real interest in cards, no love of the games themselves, and an almost frightening instinct for what ordinary people will actually pay for. He once admitted he knew nothing about making games. What he understood was people. And the first thing he understood was that selling flower cards to a single country was a dead end. Nintendo had conquered its market. The market was simply far too small. Yamauchi went looking for room to grow. In 1959, he struck a licensing deal with an American giant, Walt Disney. Nintendo printed plastic playing cards covered in Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, sold them with a how-to booklet, and pushed them into Japanese homes as wholesome family entertainment rather than gambling tools. They sold by the hundreds of thousands. For a moment, it looked like the answer. In 1962, Yamauchi took the company public. But he could see the wall ahead. Playing cards, Disney or not, were a mature product in a country of fewer than 100 million people. There were only so many decks a household would ever buy. To become something larger, Nintendo would have to stop being a card company altogether. So Yamauchi made a decision that would very nearly destroy everything his great-grandfather had built. He decided that Nintendo would do anything at all. Whatever the market seemed to want next, Nintendo would try to make it and sell it. What followed is one of the strangest chapters in corporate history. Through the 1960s, Nintendo became a company with no idea what it actually was. It launched a brand of instant rice, and it flopped. It started a taxi company called Daiya. The cabs ran well until the unions forced wages up, and Yamauchi simply walked away. It sold a vacuum cleaner. It ran a small television network. And, most famously of all, it operated a chain of love hotels, short-stay rooms rented by the hour. The story goes that Yamauchi himself would sometimes check the occupancy. None of it worked. Worse, the love hotels attracted exactly the kind of attention the old card business once had. The yakuza came looking for their cut. By the late 60s, Nintendo was hemorrhaging cash across half a dozen failed ventures, its share price sliding, the whole enterprise drifting steadily toward bankruptcy. A name 130 years old, about to vanish into a footnote, and then it was saved by a broken toy on a factory floor. His name was Gunpei Yokoi. He was not a designer or an executive. He was a maintenance engineer, hired simply to keep the card printing machines running. One slow afternoon, with the assembly line idle, Yokoi built a toy for himself out of pure boredom. A simple extending arm, a lattice of crossed wooden slats that stretched out to grab things from across the room. He was playing with it at his workbench when Hiroshi Yamauchi happened to walk past. Most bosses would have told him to get back to work. Yamauchi told him to turn it into a product for Christmas. They called it the Ultra Hand. It sold around 1.2 million units. For a company drowning in failed rice and empty hotel rooms, it was a lifeline. And far more than that, it was a revelation. Nintendo did not need to chase whatever the market was already selling. It could invent toys that no one had ever asked for. And it had just discovered, entirely by accident, that one of the most original minds in the building had been quietly fixing its machines the whole time. Yamauchi pulled Yokoi off the assembly line and put him in charge of a new division with a deliberately vague name. Games. Yokoi turned out hit after hit. A baseball pitching machine for the home, a light gun game that ran on solar cells, a periscope toy rigged up inside disused bowling alleys. And slowly, he articulated a philosophy that would define Nintendo for decades. He called it lateral thinking with withered technology. The idea was simple and quietly radical. Do not chase the newest, most expensive components. Instead, take old, cheap, thoroughly understood technology, chips that had been around for years, parts that cost almost nothing, and find a wildly creative new use for them. Let your competitors burn fortunes on the cutting edge. Nintendo would win on imagination, not on raw hardware. It is the exact opposite of how most technology companies think. And it is the single thread that runs through nearly everything Nintendo would build for the next 40 years, from a handheld in 1980 to a hybrid console decades later. In 1977, Yokoi was riding the bullet train home when he noticed a bored businessman killing time by idly mashing the buttons on his pocket calculator. The image stuck with him. What if a calculator could be a game? 3 years later, Nintendo released the Game & Watch, a flat handheld about the size of a cassette case, built from cheap calculator parts, with a tiny screen and a working clock built in so it looked respectable, sitting on an office desk. It was a sensation. Tens of millions sold. But the Game & Watch gave Nintendo something even more valuable than the profit. To control a character moving in 2 dimensions on that flat little screen, Yokoi designed a small cross-shaped pad, a plus sign you pressed with your thumb, up, down, left, and right. He called it the directional pad, the D-pad. Almost every game controller made in the 4 decades since carries some descendant of that one Yokoi invention. A bored man on a train, a pile of calculator chips, and the way the entire world would learn to move through a game. Meanwhile, Nintendo's young American outpost was in serious trouble. It had ordered 3,000 arcade cabinets for a shooting game called Radar Scope, betting it would be a hit across the United States. It was not. 2,000 unsold machines sat gathering dust in a warehouse, and the American branch was staring at ruin. Yamauchi needed someone to design a brand new game that could be loaded into all those dead cabinets. He turned, improbably, to a young staff artist with no formal game training at all, named Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto dreamed up something no one expected. A story about a carpenter climbing girders to rescue a woman from an angry ape. He named the ape Donkey Kong. The carpenter at first was simply called Jumpman. The game was a phenomenon. Those 2,000 dead cabinets were converted and sold, the American branch was saved, and Jumpman was handed a new job and a new name, Mario. The maintenance engineer and the staff artist. Between the two of them, in just a few short years, they had built the pillars Nintendo would stand on for the rest of its life. Then came the moment that should have ended Nintendo's video game ambitions before they truly began. In 1983, the entire American video game industry collapsed. Flooded with cheap, terrible titles, consumers simply walked away. Retailers were left holding worthless inventory, and the word console became poison. Atari, the giant of the era, all but imploded. Stores swore they would never stock a game machine again, and into that smoking crater, Nintendo decided to launch a console. In Japan, it was the Famicom. For America, Yamauchi's team did something brilliant. They disguised it. They refused to call it a console. They called it the Nintendo Entertainment System. They styled the box like a sleek piece of home electronics, almost a video cassette deck. They bundled it with a light gun and a small plastic robot named ROB, so that retailers believed they were stocking a toy, not the very thing they had sworn off. It worked. The machine that nobody wanted to sell went on to revive an entire industry that everyone had already declared dead. And it handed that industry straight to Nintendo. The hardware was the Trojan horse. The software was the conquest. In 1985, the entertainment system shipped in America with a game packed right inside the box. Super Mario Bros. Miyamoto and his team had spent themselves learning exactly how a jump should feel, how fast Mario should accelerate, how high he should rise, how forgiving the landing should be. They obsessed over fun as if it were an engineering discipline, because to them it genuinely was. The result sold more than 40 million copies and taught an entire generation what a video game could be. Within a few years, surveys across the United States found that more American children recognized Mario than recognized Mickey Mouse. The card company that had once licensed Disney's characters had now built a character bigger than Disney itself. Nintendo was no longer a strange Japanese curiosity that sold flower cards and rented hotel rooms by the hour. It was, suddenly, one of the most valuable entertainment companies on Earth. And it had gotten there by selling joy, by the cartridge. Gunpei Yokoi had one more masterpiece left in him. In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy. By the standards of its day, it was almost laughably primitive, a tiny gray-green screen with no color at all, running on old cheap chips, while rivals were launching full-color handhelds with brighter, sharper displays. Critics scoffed openly. Yokoi did not care in the slightest. His Withered Technology machine was lighter, far cheaper, and ran for many hours on a handful of batteries, while the color competitors drained themselves dry in a single afternoon. Bundled with a hypnotic Soviet puzzle game called Tetris, the Game Boy sold well over 100 million units and quietly buried every rival in the market. It was the purest expression of everything Yokoi had ever believed. It was also, sadly, nearly his last great act for the company. He left Nintendo in the mid-90s, and in 1997 he was killed in a roadside accident at the age of 56. The man who once pulled Nintendo back from bankruptcy with a wooden toy did not live to see most of what he made become legend. Here is the strange thing about Nintendo. It has almost never been the most powerful machine in the room. Its rivals have routinely sold consoles with faster chips and sharper graphics, and Nintendo has stumbled badly. The Nintendo 64 lost ground. A later console misjudged its audience so completely that the obituaries were written once again. Each time, the company chose to reinvent rather than to compete head-on. When the entire industry chased raw horsepower, Nintendo released the Wii, a low-powered little box you played by waving a controller in the air, and sold it to grandparents who had never touched a game in their lives. It built a dual-screen handheld, the experts openly mocked, the DS, and sold more than 150 million of them. Then in 2017, it merged its consoles and its handhelds into a single hybrid you could play on a television or carry onto a train, the Switch, and sold that one by the hundreds of millions too. The same instinct, again and again. Do not win the obvious fight. Change the game itself. Go back one last time, to that workshop in 1889, a man painting flowers onto strips of mulberry bark, selling cards to gamblers, with no electricity and no earthly reason to believe his little shop would outlive him by more than a century. Between that bench and the Switch lie instant rice and love hotels, a near bankruptcy and a broken toy, a maintenance man and a staff artist, an industry's total collapse and its unlikely rescue. Nintendo's secret was never any single product. It was a flat refusal to be defined by any one of them. When the cards stopped growing, it sold toys. When the toys grew thin, it built games. When the games industry died, it disguised a console as a toy and dragged the whole thing back to life. 130 years of being told, again and again, that its moment had passed, and answering, every single time, by inventing the next one. From hand-painted flower cards to a glowing screen in your hands. Built and rebuilt from almost nothing. If this changed how you think about reinvention, subscribe, there are more builds like this one waiting to be uncovered.